20,000 miles of pipelines sprawl across the bottom of the ocean. These pipelines are maintained by saturation divers. Obviously, one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. In Aberdeenshire, Scotland, a news outlet reports that a bad storm had continued to make waves across the UK, prompting a red weather warning. The movie opens with a man called Chris Lemons reporting to his fiancée that he has been deployed to go underwater in the North Sea for a month-long diving expedition. Although she sees it as a death sentence, because humans should be at the bottom of the North Sea, she waves it off after he assures her that he is cool with it. Chris goes over to the staging post, where he exchanges greetings with his fellow workers as he prepares for his diving expedition. After meeting up with his fellow divers, they are told by the manager, Craig, that they will live in pressurized chambers for the next month, where they will be pressurized down to 300 feet to stimulate the extreme conditions found below sea levels. They're going to be replacing a section of the pipeline where the gas flow shouldn't be interrupted or they risk losing people to cold during the winter. Craig divides them into 3 teams. Chris teams up with David and Duncan. He tries to get comfortable with David, but Dave isn't ready for a conversation. Dave asks about Chris's skills, and Duncan lets him know that he is solid enough to do the job. Once they are inside their vessels where they would live for the next month, Dave advises Chris to take off distractions from his mind once he starts diving, especially as he brought a picture of his fiancée to the diving post. Duncan, on the other hand, calms Chris down. Just as they prepare their minds for diving, they all sit to have dinner together. There, Duncan lets his team know that this will be his last rotation after 20 years of diving. Although he doesn't want to retire yet, his company feels it's the right time to do so. Meanwhile, Chris's fiancée had begun planning for their wedding, while she awaits his return. The team retires to bed as they are to resume work effectively soon. The storm, on the other hand, isn't making it easy for them as they arrive in the North Sea. Craig tells the divers to prepare for diving. Chris and Dave prepare for their dive as they gear up. Dave gives Chris a little pep talk as he tells him to follow his lead. The divers are transported by a bell that would descend them from the ship to 300 feet below sea. After donning their heavy helmets, Chris and Dave exit the bell to begin their diving expedition. However, Duncan remains in the bell to supervise the whole operation. He makes sure their comms and gas lines are all intact, including the umbilical line that supplies them with oxygen. After Chris and Dave had dived to the manifold, a power cable is being sent to them where they would connect the cable to power up the gas line manifold, so they can begin their maintenance work. Just as they enter the manifold, the ship's thrusters go offline as a violent storm emerges on the surface of the sea, causing the Topaz dynamic positioning system to malfunction. This malfunction begins to make the vessel drift as it loses total control. The divers are told to leave the manifold and abort the mission. This drifting pulls the diving bell away from its usual position, dragging the divers along with it. Just as they struggle to get on top of the manifold and locate the bell, Chris's umbilical line entangles with a manifold, preventing him from ascending further. During the struggle, the ship stops drifting as Chris's umbilical line becomes the anchor. However, it doesn't last for so long, as it snaps, causing his gas line supply to be cut off. With no chance of breathing, Chris is told to switch to his bailout, which provides only a limited amount of oxygen. Chris has only 10 minutes before his emergency oxygen runs out. Dave, on the other hand, promises to come back to rescue him, but then tells him that he must remain on top of the manifold so he can easily locate him. Just as he continues talking, the umbilical line snaps completely, leaving Chris with no means of communication or oxygen. Dave manages to locate the bell, where he reports that Chris is gone. Meanwhile, on the vessel, the crew tries to find a solution to the ship drifting. A desperate Craig makes a suggestion to drop anchors and gain control of the ship, but the captain lets him know that they are unable to drop anchors because of the oil pipeline down there. The anchor could snag any of the pipelines and rupture it, causing an environmental disaster. With just 7 minutes of oxygen left, Chris tries to find the rest of the crew in the manifold. He brings out his compass, but then finds out it's dead. On the other hand, the captain suggests that they manually operate the ship thrusters. Although the ship isn't built for that condition, and could end up being at risk. The captain still gives the go-ahead, as he believes the ship could drift further away from Chris if he doesn't manually stop it from drifting. The captain and the first officer then begin operating on the drifting manually. Chris, with just 4 minutes of oxygen left, manages to locate the manifold. He struggles to climb and eventually finds himself at the top, with absolutely no one in sight. With all hope lost, he begins to think about his fiancée and the last video message she sent to him. She is worried about his job and how he always comforted her about the risk of the job. She just wants her lover to come back home as she wishes him well, tearfully. Chris finally gives up as he falls unconsciously on top of the manifold. The crew continue to find a solution to the drifting problem, as they hope things don't go from bad to worse. Meanwhile, another member of the crew uses an ROV to search for Chris's body. He's surprised to find Chris on top of the manifold still alive, but in a terrible condition as he had completely gone out of oxygen. On the other hand, the dynamic positioning officer is made to bypass the reboot process for the DPS. He manages to locate the wire as he lets the captain know that every part of the DPS is routed through a startup CPU, and it would take so much time to boot up, so he has to physically rewire it and bypass the reboot, but then he needs to patch it back correctly, which means getting the whole sequence right. With Chris's vitals becoming weak as he had an oxygen starvation, Craig suggests that he is picked up with the ROV as it is rated to pick humans. However, the ROV is made specifically for body recoveries and not alive beings. Craig is willing to risk it all and then accepts to take control of the ROV and full-time responsibility for Chris. He controls the propeller as he targets the D-ring attached to Chris's suit. Craig is able to hook the ROV onto it but then is unable to lift Chris because he had clipped himself onto the manifold to avoid getting washed away by the tide when he's unconscious. In an emotional moment, Duncan narrates how he and Chris first met to Dave. He had met Chris on a rescue op dive after a lobster boat went down on the Scottish coast. They had coned to recover the bodies, but couldn't find the last one. After thorough searching, they gave up and decided to give his mourning wife a shoebox full of all his stuff they cleaned up from the wreck. With tears in his eyes, Duncan vows not to give Chris' fiancée a shoebox. He continues by saying he won't give up on him. The DPO finally manages to reboot the ship and gain control of the DPS. They rapidly make for the manifold as they reposition the vessel to facilitate their rescue. Once they locate the manifold, the bell is lowered and Dave goes on to rescue Chris, who had been out without oxygen for over 29 minutes. Dave unhooks Chris from the manifold as he fastens him to the umbilical line. They make their way to the bell, but then the vessel loses balance because of the weight, causing a crash. Craig is devastated, thinking another diver has been lost. However, Dave appears heroically, climbing upon the umbilical line, with Chris still attached to him. He doesn't give up despite the wave, and with the help of an extra motivation from Duncan, he manages to make it inside the bell with Chris. After Duncan had removed his helmet, with no sign of life, he proceeds to give Chris a mouth-to-mouth but all to no avail. However, after a while, Chris breathes a little, but then he becomes unresponsive. Duncan and the whole crew wait with faith to see if a miracle can happen. But after waiting for so long, Duncan declares him dead. He tells Dave not to feel bad, saying he did rescue him, and that's a lot to cheer up on. Dave decides to try his luck. He asks Chris to give him a responsive sign as he doesn't want to give up on him. Well, it still resulted in the same unresponsive Chris, as he has suffered from oxygen deprivation to the brain for so long. Just as the mood in the vessel had gone to zero, Chris asks Dave if he's okay. Chris had defied the odds of survival after such a long period without oxygen. The whole crew are in a celestial mood, as they rejoice with tears that he actually managed to survive. Craig congratulates the teary captain, as he tells them to abort the mission and bring the divers back to the surface. After they had all ascended back to the surface, Chris begins his recuperation in the saturation chambers. Just as Dave comes to check up on Chris's pulse, he narrates his ordeal on what happened after he went numb for over 30 minutes. He had begun to think about his fiancée. Chris had promised her that he would be okay, and she doesn't have to worry about him. So at that moment, it all felt like he had let her down, so he decided to just have a peaceful rest and not to struggle with the thought of not breathing. He thanks Dave tearfully, saying he could have been dead if not for him. Just as he leaves him, Dave goes on to bring out a picture of him and his 2 daughters. Decompression day 2, Chris calls his fiancée, telling her that his expedition had been cut short because of a problem with the ship, so he would be arriving at Aberdeen the following morning. On the last day of decompression, Chris bids Duncan and the crew farewell as he departs the vessel. He goes back home to his fiancée, where he narrates what happened below sea and his near-death experience. In an emotional scene, they share a kiss. A closing note reveals that Chris suffered no lasting physical or mental damage, with experts unable to provide a definitive explanation for his survival. 3 weeks after the incident, Chris returns to the bottom of the North Sea with his teammates Dave and Duncan to finish the one job they started. The movie then came to an end. Kindly subscribe for more movie recap like this. Thanks for watching and goodbye.